Chronicles chapter 4, beginning at verse 9. And Jabez was more honorable than his brethren, and his mother called him Jabez, saying, Because I bear him with sorrow. And Jabez called on the God of Israel, saying, Oh, that thou wouldest bless me indeed, and enlarge my coast, and that thy hand might be with me, and that thou wouldest keep me from evil, that it may not grieve me. And God granted him that which he requested. So from our reading tonight, it's quite obvious I want to speak again about the matter of prayer, especially in view of the fact that on Saturday there is a call to prayer. The nation is called to prayer, and what a good thing it is when people begin to seek God. But when we look at this book of Chronicles, we must remember that in the original writings, the 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, they were one book, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. And we find that while we haven't got in the Old Testament the name of the writer to the Chronicles, Jewish tradition tells us it was Ezra, the scribe, that compiled this book, or these books now, these two books, and he compiled them about 400 BC. That was after the captivity of Israel. You remember, because of the sin and disobedience of the nation of Israel, they were carried away, they lost their land, they lost their throne, they lost their temple, and they were taken into Babylon. And then after 70 years, a remnant came out, back to the land, and they rebuilt the temple again. And Ezra the scribe was there, and he wrote the Chronicles. When you read Samuel and Kings and also Chronicles, you might think that the book of Chronicles is simply a repetition, largely, of what we find in Samuel and Kings. But this is not so, because if you study it carefully, you'll find there's a lot of things left out of Chronicles that you find in the books of Samuel and Kings. And there's a lot of things put into Chronicles which we don't find in the former books. The reason is that Samuel and Kings deal with the history of Israel in regard to the throne of David, or the throne that God has appointed. Chronicles deals with the history of Israel in regard to the temple, or the worship of that people. Now this is very, very important, because when the remnant came back from Babylon, they didn't come back to set up a throne or to have a king. The first thing they did was to build the temple and get going in prayer and worship. You see, because Israel lost their king and lost their throne and lost their land because, first of all, they forsook God. They gave up worshipping God. They became like the idolatrous nations around them. And thus, instead of seeking God and cleaving to God and praying to God, the rot set in, and the result was they lost their throne, they lost their land, they lost everything and were carried away. So when those came back, they said the first thing to do is to seek God, and we're going to build the temple. Now surely that's got a message for us today. Why is England in the state it is today? Why is it that women don't go out at night today when they could when I was a boy? Why is it that I couldn't hold children's meetings at night now as I used to 30 or 40 years ago? Why is it that crime and violence and wickedness and sin and the occult and all these wicked things are here? It is because the nation as a whole, nationally, has turned from God, has forgotten God, has failed to seek God. And not only have they lost all the blessings and the privileges that we once enjoyed, but we've lost our prestige among the nations and our power and influence that we had. When Queen Victoria ruled over England, we had a large empire. It was at its greatest point almost, and she handed a Bible to an African prince, and she said, "This is the secret of England's greatness. And so we need to get back to God. I think our last National Day of Prayer was in the war, when our backs were up against the wall, and we were about to be annihilated, and we called upon God, and God came in and defeated the enemy, because God does hear, and God does answer prayer. So when Ezra takes up his pen to record the nation's history, Israel's history after the captivity, he writes it from the standpoint of the temple. And he tells us how important it is to seek God. Everything in that book is from the standpoint of spiritual worship and seeking God and the temple, because that was the basis of the nation. So when we're right with God, the other things follow. How good that is. As long as he sought the Lord his God, it says of Uzziah, God made him to prosper. That's just one of the kings. But how true that is, not only for that king, but for individuals and nations seeking God in prayer. So then, we're going to look tonight at this man Jabez. It might seem that when we read the first 9 chapters, they're pretty dry. We might say, what on earth is the good of all these genealogies? Now, jotted a note down here. Such lines of descent were of sacred importance to all the godly Jews, for they knew that their nation was the possessor of wonderful divine promises, reaching to unborn generations. The Angus Handbook says, these tables give the sacred line through which the promise was transmitted for nearly 3,500 years, a fact unexampled in the human race. And so it was possible for these Jews to trace their genealogy. It was possible that when Christ came to show that he was of the line of the tribe of Judah, that he was the promised seed through Abraham, the promised king through David, and these genealogies were sacred to the Jews. And that's why they're here. In Chronicles, we have this long list of names. Now we find that the writer, as we go through this list, every now and again he stops at a certain man and comments on him. For instance, in chapter 1, verse 10, and Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be mighty upon the earth. Not much to say, but a little about Nimrod. Verse 19, unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, because in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Chapter 2, we have another verse there about, in verse 3, the sons of Judah, and Onan and Shelah, which 3 were born unto him of the daughter of Shua the Canaanitess. And the firstborn of Judah, was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he slew him. So every now and again he stops and he comments on people. Sometimes the comment is good, sometimes the comment is bad. And our stop we're going to look at tonight is chapter 4, about Jabez, and what he was, and what he did, and what he got from God. That should encourage us, I trust. First of all then, in verse 9 of chapter 4, and Jabez was more honorable than his brethren. Again, Jewish writers tell us that Jabez was an eminent doctor that had studied the law, and he drew so many scribes around him that actually they built a town in commemoration of him. The town is mentioned in chapter 2, verse 55, and the families of the scribes which dwelt at Jabez. That's all we learn from tradition. But we're not so worried about what tradition tells us about Jabez, but what does God say about him? It's good to hear what God has to say about him.